You sit there scrolling through your feed and you might see a headline that looks like a joke. A crude hand-painted Russian flag on the side of a rusting oil tanker. It sounds like a prank, doesn't it? It sounds like something from a comedy sketch. But I am here to tell you that this joke is actually the tombstone of American deterrence. We are witnessing a moment in history that future historians will look back on as the definitive end of the Monroe Doctrine. The event involving the oil tanker Bella One is not just a maritime curiosity, it is a geopolitical earthquake. It is the moment the United States Coast Guard, the enforcement arm of the global hegemon in its own backyard, was paralyzed, not by a hypersonic missile, not by a carrier strike group, but by a bucket of paint and the terrifying implication of who stands behind it. Let us look at the facts. Stripped of the Western media's attempt to downplay the humiliation. For 2 weeks, the United States fleet has been chasing the Bella One. This is a massive vessel, a very large crude carrier, sanctioned by Washington, accused of moving Iranian and Venezuelan oil. In the old world, the world of unipolar American power, this story ends one way. The U.S. Coast Guard fires a warning shot, board the vessel, seize the cargo, and drag the crew to a U.S. port. That is how the script was written in the 1,990 seconds. That is how it was written during the War on Terror. But we are not in the 1,990 seconds anymore. We are in 2026, and the script has been burned. When the American forces moved in for the kill, ready to board, the crew of the Bella One did something audacious. They did not fire back. They simply took out brushes and painted the Russian tricolor white, blue, and red on the hull. They radioed the Americans and said, essentially, we are now under the protection of the Russian Federation. And what did the most powerful Navy in history do? Did they laugh? Did they proceed with the boarding? No, they froze. They aborted the mission. They sat in the water, engines idling, terrified of the implications. Washington is so petrified of a direct escalation with Vladimir Putin that a crude wet painting on a rust bucket was enough to establish a force field that American hard power could not penetrate. To understand the gravity of this, you have to understand the history of this region. This is the Caribbean. This is the Atlantic approach to the Americas. For 200 years, under the Monroe Doctrine, the United States claimed this ocean as its private lake. No foreign power was allowed to interfere here. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was the Soviet ships that turned around. It was Moscow that blinked when faced with the U.S. Navy's blockade. That was the height of American power. The mere presence of U.S. destroyers was enough to force a superpower to retreat. Now, look at the reversal. Look at the poetic irony. Today, it is the U.S. fleet that halts. It is the U.S. fleet that is paralyzed by the mere symbol of Russia. The roles have completely flipped. The Bella One didn't even need a real Russian warship escort. It just needed the idea of Russia to defeat the U.S. Coast Guard. This is what we call the collapse of deterrence. Deterrence is psychological. It relies on the enemy believing that you will act. When the U.S. paused its seizure operation because of a hastily painted flag, they sent a signal to Beijing, to Tehran, to Pyongyang, and to Caracas. They signaled that the U.S. red lines are made of chalk, easily washed away by a little resistance. The Bella One, now reportedly re-registered as the Marinera in a lightning-fast bureaucratic maneuver by Moscow, exposes the systemic hypocrisy of the rules-based international order. The Americans love to talk about rules when those rules serve their interests. They seize ships. They confiscate gold. They freeze assets, claiming it is law enforcement. But the moment a rival great power steps in, even with a clumsy, hand-painted gesture, the law evaporates, and the raw reality of power politics takes over. Think about the humiliation of the American commanders on those ships. They have the firepower to turn that tanker into scrap metal in seconds, but they cannot use it. They are bound by the strategic paralysis of a dying empire. They know that touching a ship claiming Russian protection, even falsely, could trigger a chain reaction that Washington is too weak to handle. This is the definition of imperial overstretch. The empire is everywhere, but it can enforce nothing. It chases ghosts across the Atlantic, burning fuel and prestige only to be checkmated by a crew with a paint roller. This incident is the perfect opening chapter to our analysis today because it encapsulates the thesis I have been arguing for years. U.S. hegemony is not dying from a sudden heart attack. It is dying from 1,000 cuts of humiliation. It is dying because the rest of the world has realized that the emperor has no clothes, or in this case, that the emperor has no stomach for a real fight. The Bella One is the Suez moment of the Caribbean. Just as the Suez crisis of 1956 proved the British Empire was finished as a global power, this standoff proves the U.S. can no longer dictate terms in its own hemisphere. We must also look at the timing. This is happening while the U.S. is trying to enforce a blockade on Venezuela, trying to strangle the Maduro government, trying to cut off oil revenues, and yet here is a tanker, likely full of Iranian or Venezuelan oil, sailing freely because it donned the colors of the Kremlin. It proves that the sanctions regime, the primary weapon of modern U.S. warfare, is broken. If you can bypass the U.S. Treasury Department with a paint job, then the dollar's weaponization is effectively over. The psychological barrier has been breached. If the Bella One gets away with this, and it looks like it will, every tanker in the Shadow Fleet will be painting Russian, Chinese, or Iranian flags on their hulls by next week. In this video, we are going to dissect this failure. We are going to look at the mechanism of this standoff, the circumvention of U.S. power, and the terrifying reality that Washington refuses to accept. The world is multipolar, and the U.S. Navy no longer owns the seas. The painting on the hull of the Bella One is not graffiti. It is the writing on the wall for the American century. To truly appreciate the magnitude of this failure, we must look beneath the surface of the water, past the painted steel of the hull, and examine the machinery of American power that has just ground to a halt. What the Bella One defeated was not just a Coast Guard cutter. It defeated the weaponization of the global financial system. For the last 2 decades, the United States has not fought its wars primarily with soldiers. It has fought them with bankers. It has fought them with the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC. The strategy was simple and brutal. If a nation disobeyed Washington, whether it was Iran, Venezuela, or Russia, the U.S. would cut them off from the U.S. dollar, ensure that no ship could carry their goods, and effectively starve their economy into submission. This was a clean way to destroy a country without putting American boots on the ground. But the Bella One incident proves that this mechanism is now obsolete. The maximum pressure campaign has failed because it assumed the victims would have nowhere else to go. It assumed a unipolar world where all roads led to New York and London. That world is dead. What we saw in the Caribbean was the physical manifestation of the Shadow Fleet. This is not a handful of rogue smugglers. This is a massive, parallel global logistics network, hundreds of tankers operating outside of Western insurance, outside of Western maritime law, and outside of the U.S. dollar. The U.S. intelligence community knows this fleet exists. They track it via satellite, but as we just saw, they are powerless to physically stop it without risking World War III. The genius of the maneuver by the Bella One, painting that crude Russian flag, is that it exploited the very legalisms the West created. The United States has spent years building a complex legal framework to justify seizing ships. They claim they are upholding international law. But by claiming Russian nationality, the tanker instantly transformed from a stateless rogue into sovereign territory of a nuclear superpower. The U.S. Coast Guard, trained to act as the maritime police for the U.S. Treasury, suddenly found themselves in a Mexican standoff with Moscow. They realized that their authority only extends as far as the other side is willing to recognize it. When the other side is backed by the Kremlin, American authority dissolves into salt water. Consider the panic this induces in the halls of the State Department. The entire U.S. strategy against Venezuela was based on the premise that they could block oil exports. If Venezuela can simply paint a flag on a hull and sail past the blockade, the sanctions are worthless. And it is not just the flag, it is the infrastructure behind it. This tanker likely operates with Russian or Chinese state-backed insurance. It is likely carrying oil that has already been paid for in yuan or rubles, bypassing the SWIFT system entirely. The U.S. is trying to enforce a toll booth on a highway that the rest of the world has already bypassed. They are standing there with their ticket book demanding payment in dollars while the traffic flows effortlessly onto the new BRICS superhighway right next to them. This circumvention is systemic. It is the result of the weaponization of interdependence. The U.S. abused its position as a global financial hub so aggressively that it forced its adversaries to build an immune system. The Bella One is that immune system in action. The crew knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that the U.S. commander on that interceptor ship would have to call his superiors. They knew that the call would go up the chain of command to the Pentagon and the White House. And they knew that the Biden administration, terrified of an oil price spike in an election year and terrified of giving Putin a pretext for escalation in the Atlantic, would blink. The hand-painted flag is the ultimate symbol of asymmetric warfare. It costs $50 in paint to defeat a billion-dollar naval deployment. It exposes the rigidity of the American military mind. The U.S. Navy is built to fight the Battle of Midway. It is built to sink Soviet carriers in the North Atlantic. It is not built to handle a gray zone conflict where the enemy uses lawfare and symbolism as a shield. The U.S. is prepared for kinetic war, but it is losing the hybrid war. They have the missiles, but they lack the maneuverability. The Bella One effectively hacked the U.S. rules of engagement. It turned the U.S.'s own risk aversion against it. Furthermore, this signals the definitive end to the effectiveness of the media narrative as a weapon. For years, the West could simply label a ship illegal, and the world would comply. Insurance companies would drop them, ports would refuse them entry. But who controls the ports now? If this ship is heading to China or India or a friendly port in the global south, those nations do not care what the New York Times or the State Department says. They see the U.S. sanctions as illegitimate tools of economic warfare. The pariah status the U.S. tries to inflict on Venezuela or Russia no longer sticks. In the eyes of the global majority, the Bella One is not a smuggler. It is a resistance fighter breaking an illegal blockade. The panic in Washington right now is palpable because they see the domino effect. If a tanker can do this, why not a cargo ship carrying high-tech components to China? Why not a vessel carrying weapons? The U.S. Coast Guard has effectively admitted that they cannot board a vessel if it claims protection from a great power rival. They have ceded control of the Caribbean. They have admitted that the Monroe Doctrine is unenforceable against a determined peer competitor. The ocean is vast, and the U.S. Navy is shrinking. They cannot be everywhere at once, and now, even when they are there, they are impotent. The Bella One just sailed through the net, and behind it, the whole ocean is pouring through. The United States has spent the last century perfecting a specific kind of trap, a moral trap. They tell the world, we are not an empire, we are the police. We are not conquering you, we are enforcing the rules. This narrative allowed them to bomb Belgrade, invade Baghdad, and destroy Tripoli, all while claiming the moral high ground. But the Bella One incident has just snapped that trap shut on the leg of the hunter. The hand-painted Russian flag on that tanker is not just a clever legal trick. It is a mirror reflecting the ugly face of American coercion back at Washington. Let us be brutally honest about what we are seeing. The U.S. Coast Guard was prepared to board a commercial vessel in international waters, seize its cargo, and arrest its crew. In any other century, this would be called piracy. It would be called privateering. But the Americans call it sanctions enforcement. They wrap the iron fist of theft in the velvet glove of democracy promotion. They claim they are seizing the oil to punish the dictator Maduro, to free the Venezuelan people. But look at the reality on the ground. Who suffers when a blockade is enforced? It is not the elite in Caracas. It is the child in a hospital in Maracaibo who cannot get medicine because the state has no revenue. It is the taxi driver who cannot buy gas. The U.S. strategy of economic strangulation is a weapon of mass destruction that targets the poor, and the world is finally waking up to this monstrosity. The reason the Bella One found safety behind a Russian flag is because the world has learned the lesson of the last 30 years. That lesson is written in blood across the Middle East and North Africa. Look at Libya. In 2011, Muammar Gaddafi gave up his nuclear program. He tried to play by Western rules. And what happened? The moment he was vulnerable, the NATO humanitarian machine descended, destroyed the state, and left a slave market in its wake. Look at Iraq. 1 million dead based on a lie about WMDs. Look at Syria, where U.S. sanctions, the Caesar Act, are currently starving a population that survived a decade of war. The global south watches this. The leaders in Caracas, in Tehran, in Bamako, and in Brasilia, they all take notes. They know that if they stand alone against the U.S., they will be crushed. They know that international law is a tool the West uses to handcuff its victims before beating them. So, what is the logical response? You find a bigger brother. You find a protector who does not care about Western moralizing. You find Russia. You find China. The Bella One painting that flag is a direct consequence of the U.S. destroying the concept of neutrality. There is no middle ground anymore. You are either a vassal of Washington or you are an enemy to be starved. By forcing this binary choice, the U.S. has actually created the anti-American alliance it fears most. They pushed Venezuela into Russia's arms. They pushed Iran into China's arms. And now, when a tanker simply paints a red, white, and blue stripe on its hull, the U.S. is paralyzed because they realize they are no longer fighting a lonely, isolated state. They are fighting a bloc that remembers every coup, every invasion, and every sanctimonious lecture from the State Department. This is the moral trap. If the U.S. Coast Guard boards that ship now, they are not enforcing the law in the eyes of the world. They are committing an act of war against a great power to steal oil. The mask of the benevolent policeman falls off, revealing the desperate empire underneath. But if they don't board as they haven't, they admit that their morality only applies to the weak. They admit that their values are negotiable when a nuclear power is involved. Washington is currently paralyzed by the consequences of its own coercion. They wanted to turn Venezuela into a pariah. Instead, they turned it into a fortress backed by the Kremlin. They wanted to cut off the oil revenue to starve the regime. Instead, they incentivized the creation of a massive, dark logistics network that no Western bank can touch. They have lost the moral argument, and now they are losing the physical argument. The irony is suffocating. The U.S. claims to protect the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, yet here they are in the Atlantic, trying to stop the freedom of navigation for anyone who disagrees with them. The Bella One is exposing this double standard in real time. Every hour that ship sails free under a hand-painted flag is a diplomatic victory for the revisionist powers. It tells the world the Americans are bullies, but they are cowardly bullies. Stand up, paint your flag, and they will freeze. As we move to the next part of this analysis, we have to look at the fallout. This isn't just about one ship. This is about a signal being broadcast to the entire planet. What happens when the rest of the global south decides to paint their own flags? What happens when the asymmetric warfare of the weak defeats the shock and awe of the strong? The U.S. has relied on fear to maintain order, but the fear is gone. And when the fear is gone, the empire crumbles. The paralysis of the U.S. Coast Guard is not an isolated incident. It is the starting gun for a global reckoning. We are witnessing the terrifying dawn of reciprocal escalation in the Western Hemisphere. For decades, American foreign policy strategists have operated under the arrogant assumption that the United States could sow chaos in the backyards of its rivals in Ukraine and Taiwan, in the Caucasus, while its own backyard remained a pristine sanctuary of safety. The Bella One incident shatters that delusion. It proves that the gray zone war is no longer confined to the Donbass of the South China Sea. It has arrived in the Caribbean. Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping have studied the American playbook meticulously. They have realized that they do not need to match the United States carrier for carrier. That is a fool's game. Instead, they are employing a strategy of asymmetric cost imposition. Think about the mathematics of this standoff. It costs the United States Navy billions of dollars to deploy a carrier strike group or a Coast Guard task force to the region. It costs millions in fuel, maintenance, and personnel hours to maintain a blockade. And what did it cost Russia to defeat that deployment? The price of a phone call to authorize the re-registration of a ship and the cost of a few buckets of paint. This is an unsustainable exchange rate for the American empire. The U.S. is bleeding resources to chase shadows, while its adversaries spend pennies to create strategic paralysis. This is the essence of asymmetric warfare in the 21st century. The global South is not mobilizing armies. It is mobilizing sovereignty. We are seeing a diplomatic mobilization where nations like Iran, Venezuela, and even fence-sitters like Saudi Arabia are realizing that alignment with the BRICS bloc offers a security guarantee that Washington cannot penetrate. The Bella One is a floating testament to the effectiveness of this new alliance structure. It demonstrates that BRICS is rapidly evolving from a loose economic forum into a de facto mutual defense pact against Western economic coercion. When a Venezuelan ship can claim Russian protection, the boundaries between these nations dissolve into a unified front against American hegemony. We must also analyze the terrifying signal this sends regarding national security and the U.S. domestic economy. The United States Navy has effectively marketed itself as the guarantor of global maritime trade. They claim that without them, the oceans would be anarchic. But the Bella One proves that the U.S. can no longer guarantee the enforcement of its own rules. If the U.S. cannot stop a sanctioned tanker in the Caribbean, how can it possibly guarantee the safety of shipping in the Strait of Hormuz or the Malacca Strait in the event of a real conflict? The illusion of omnipotence is the only thing keeping global insurance rates and shipping costs stable. Once that illusion evaporates, as it is doing right now, the risk premium on everything rises. This is where the geopolitical chess game hits your wallet. The failure of U.S. deterrence is inflationary. If the U.S. tries to reassert control, it will have to escalate. It will have to start shooting. And if the U.S. starts shooting at Russian-flagged, even falsely flagged vessels in the Atlantic, we are looking at an immediate catastrophic spike in oil prices. We are talking about $200 or $300 a barrel. The Biden administration knows this. They are trapped. If they do nothing, they look weak, and the shadow fleet grows. If they act, they risk an economic collapse at home and a hot war with a nuclear peer. This is the zugzwang of the late-stage empire chess situation where every move leads to a worse position. Furthermore, we must consider the intelligence failure here. The U.S. intelligence community spends $80 billion a year, yet they were seemingly blindsided by a tactic as primitive as painting a flag on a hole. This suggests a deep systemic rot within the U.S. national security state. They are so obsessed with high-tech surveillance, with signals, intelligence, and cyber warfare that they have forgotten the human element of deception. They have forgotten that a determined enemy will always find a low-tech loophole and high-tech fence. The Bella One crew, likely advising with Russian handlers, understood the psychology of the American commander better than the Pentagon understood the resolve of the Venezuelan crew. The global South is watching this and realizing that the American lake is drying up. We are likely to see an increase in Russian and Chinese naval visits to Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. The Bella One is the scout, the icebreaker. Now that the precedent is set, the path is clear for a more permanent foreign military presence in the Americas. The Monroe Doctrine is effectively dead. It was killed not by a grand treaty, but by the reality that the U.S. lacks the will to enforce it against a nuclear rival. The strategic depth the U.S. has enjoyed for 2 centuries, the safety of 2 vast oceans is gone. The rivals are inside the gates, and they didn't even have to kick the door down. They just painted a new sign on the door and walked right in. As we stare into this abyss, we must recognize that this is the inevitable result of hubris. You cannot expand NATO to the borders of Russia and expect Russia to stay out of the Caribbean. You cannot arm Taiwan and expect China to stay out of Latin America. The world is a closed system. The pressure you apply in one place will inevitably burst a pipe in another. The Bella One is that burst pipe, and the water rising around the feet of the U.S. establishment is getting higher by the hour. The incident with the Bella One forces us to confront the ultimate reality that the foreign policy establishment in Washington has spent 30 years denying. The era of American exceptionalism is over. We are no longer living in a world where the United States can dictate the weather. We are living in a world where we must build shelter like everyone else. The end of history was a myth. and history has returned with a vengeance, wearing the painted colors of a Russian flag on a Venezuelan tanker. The United States now faces a binary choice, a choice that will determine whether it survives this century as a prosperous republic or collapses as a burning empire. The first option is the path of adaptation, of realism, and of humility. This path requires Washington to look at that tanker and admit defeat. It requires the State Department to acknowledge that the Monroe Doctrine is unenforceable in a nuclear age. It demands a retreat from the fantasy of global policing and a return to the defense of the actual national interest, borders, industry, and social cohesion at home. It means accepting a multipolar world where Russia has a sphere of influence, China has a sphere of influence, and the U.S. is just one great power among many, not the God King of the planet. But I fear, and I say this with deep cynicism, that the American establishment is incapable of making this choice. They are addicted to the illusion of control. To admit that a hand-painted flag defeated the U.S. Navy is to admit that their entire worldview is fraudulent. It is to admit that the trillions spent on defense have bought them nothing but insecurity. So, they will likely choose the second path. They will double down. They will scream louder about international norms while violating them. They will print more money to fund more feudal,